The whiskey bottle slipped from Ethan Ellis's fingers and shattered against the saloon floor, amber liquid pooling around his worn boots. But for the first time in 3 years, he didn't bend down to salvage what he could. His hands trembled as he stared through the dusty window at the stagecoach rolling into Fairplay, Colorado on that blistering afternoon in July of 1876. And somehow he knew with absolute certainty that everything in his miserable existence was about to change. The woman who stepped down from that coach wore a traveling dress the color of storm clouds, her dark hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet. And when she turned her face toward the mountains surrounding their little mining town, Ethan saw something in her profile that made his chest constrict with a feeling he had thought drowned long ago in rotgut and regret. She moved with purpose, despite the obvious exhaustion of travel, one gloved hand gripping a worn carpet bag, while the other shaded her eyes against the fierce mountain sun. Even from across the muddy street, he could see the determination in the set of her shoulders, the way she squared herself against the curious stares of the miners and merchants going about their business. "You going to clean that up, Ellis, or just stand there gawking?" The saloon owner's voice cut through his trance, sharp and impatient as always. Ethan tore his gaze away from the window and looked down at the mess he had made. His hands were still shaking, but not from the need for another drink. For 3 years, ever since the mine collapse that had taken his younger brother Samuel, he had lived in a haze of alcohol that dulled the edges of memory and guilt. 3 years of waking up in his own vomit, of hands that couldn't hold a pickaxe steady, of watching his father's ranch fall into disrepair because he couldn't stay sober long enough to mend a fence or feed the horses properly. 3 years of being the town drunk, the cautionary tale mothers whispered to their sons about what happened when a man let grief consume him. "I'll clean it up," Ethan said quietly, but as he grabbed a rag and knelt beside the broken glass, something fundamental had shifted inside him. The craving that had lived in his throat like a persistent fire had suddenly cooled to nothing. He swept up the shards carefully, each movement deliberate, aware that he was also sweeping away the man he had been just moments before. The woman had disappeared from view by the time he finished, probably making her way to the boarding house at the end of Main Street, where most newcomers stayed until they found more permanent lodging. Fairplay was still a rough mining town despite its 10 years of existence, perched high in the Rocky Mountains where gold and silver drew desperate men willing to risk everything for a strike that might never come. The elevation made the air thin and the winters brutal, but the summers blazed with an intensity that could parch a man's throat in minutes. Ethan's throat was dry now, but not for whiskey. He stood up, brushed the dust from his knees, and walked out of the saloon without a word to anyone. The afternoon sun hit him like a physical blow, and he squinted against it as he made his way down the street. His legs felt steadier than they had in years, as though the simple act of putting down that bottle had restored something essential to his body. The boarding house was a 2-story structure with fresh white paint that the owner, Mrs. Henderson, insisted on applying every spring. Ethan stood outside for a long moment, trying to understand what had driven him here, what madness had possessed him to follow a complete stranger across town. He had no business approaching any woman in his current state, still wearing clothes that smelled of whiskey and sweat, his beard untrimmed for weeks, his hair hanging past his collar in greasy tangles. But before he could turn away, the door opened and she emerged, having apparently decided that the boarding house was not to her liking. Up close, Ethan could see that she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 22 or 23 to his 26 years. Her eyes were a startling green that reminded him of aspen leaves in summer, And when those eyes landed on him with obvious wariness, he felt something in his chest lurch sideways. "Can I help you?" Her voice was cultured, Eastern, with the crisp consonants of someone educated beyond the rough standards of mining towns. Ethan realized he had no idea what to say. "Welcome to Fairplay, miss. I saw you arrive and wanted to make sure you found your way all right." She studied him with an expression that suggested she was accustomed to measuring men quickly and finding them wanting. Her gaze traveled from his unkempt hair to his stained shirt to his scuffed boots, and he saw the exact moment she categorized him as harmless, but beneath her notice. "That's very kind," she said, in a tone that indicated it was anything but. "I'm quite capable of managing on my own, thank you." She moved to step past him, and Ethan knew he should let her go, should slink back to whatever hole he had crawled out of and leave this proper lady alone. Instead, he heard himself say, "The boarding house is full up with miners. Mrs. Henderson won't have told you straight because she likes to seem hospitable, but those men get loud at night and sometimes worse than loud. It's not safe for a woman alone." She stopped, turned back to face him with a frown creasing her smooth forehead. "And I suppose you have a better suggestion. My father owns a ranch about 2 miles outside town. My mother passed 5 years back, but her old rooms are still there, separate from the main house. It's quiet and clean, and there's a lock on the door." The words tumbled out before he could consider how inappropriate the offer was, how it must sound to her. "Let me understand this correctly," she said slowly, her green eyes narrowing. "You're a stranger who approached me on the street, and now you're inviting me to stay at an isolated ranch with you and your father. Do I have that right?" Heat flooded Ethan's face. Put that way, it sounded like the setup for something terrible. "You're right. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have presumed. He ran a hand through his filthy hair. "This town isn't kind to women traveling alone, especially educated women who might have something worth taking. I was trying to help, but I can see how it sounds." He turned to leave, shame burning in his gut, but her voice stopped him. "Wait." When he looked back, she was regarding him with a different expression, something between curiosity and calculation. "What's your name?" "Ethan Ellis, miss." "Zara Bennett," she said, and offered her gloved hand in a gesture so formal it seemed out of place on the dusty street. He shook it carefully, aware of how rough his own hand must feel even through the fabric. "And you're right about one thing. The boarding house is completely unsuitable. Mrs. Henderson has 6 miners sleeping in what she generously called the ladies' parlor, and I could smell the whiskey from the hallway. Then you'll consider my offer." Hope sparked in Ethan's chest, irrational and fierce. Zara tilted her head, studying him again with those sharp green eyes. "Why do you care where a stranger stays?" It was a fair question, and Ethan found himself answering with more honesty than he intended. "Because 3 minutes ago I dropped my last bottle of whiskey and realized I haven't been properly sober in 3 years. Because my brother died and I let it destroy me, and I've been useless and pathetic ever since. And because when I saw you step off that coach, something in me woke up for the first time since the mine took Samuel, and I don't understand it, but I'm not going to question it either." Zara's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The sounds of Fairplay swirled around them, hammers ringing against anvils, men shouting to each other about claims and essays, a dog barking somewhere down the street. "Finally," she said, "that was either the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me, or you're a very practiced liar." "I'm a lot of things, Miss Bennett, but I've never been a good liar." She seemed to come to some internal decision, her shoulders relaxing fractionally. "All right, Mr. Ellis. I'll take you up on your offer with conditions. I'll meet your father first in a public place. If he vouches for you and the arrangements seem appropriate, I'll consider staying at your ranch. But I warn you, I have very little tolerance for nonsense, and despite appearances, I know how to defend myself." Relief washed through Ethan so intensely it left him dizzy. "That's more than fair. My father usually comes into town on Saturday afternoons to pick up supplies at the general store. Today's Saturday. He should be along within the hour." "Then I'll wait," Zara said simply, and settled herself on the bench outside the general store with her carpetbag at her feet and her hands folded primly in her lap. Ethan found himself at a loss. He couldn't just stand there staring at her for an hour, but he was afraid that if he left, she might change her mind and disappear. Instead, he sat down on the opposite end of the bench, leaving a respectable distance between them, and tried not to think about how much he wanted a drink to steady his nerves. The silence stretched between them, awkward but not entirely uncomfortable. Finally, Zara said, "You said your brother died in a mine collapse. 3 years ago. 3 years and 2 months, Ethan said quietly. "The Excelsior mine just up the mountain from here. 16 men went down that day. Samuel was 19, still thought he was invincible. I was supposed to be working that shift with him, but I had stayed out late the night before and overslept. He covered for me, said I was sick." The words felt like stones in his mouth. "I've been drowning in whiskey ever since, trying to forget that he died in my place." "And you think staying sober now will somehow make up for it?" There was no judgment in her voice, just genuine curiosity, and somehow that made it easier to answer. "No, nothing will make up for it. But I've been wasting the life he saved for 3 years, and that seems like an even worse betrayal. Today, when I saw you, something just clicked, like a door opening in a room I'd been locked in for so long I'd forgotten what light looked like." Zara was quiet for a long moment. "I came to Fairplay because I'm running away from my own locked room," she said finally. "My father died 6 months ago and left me nothing but debts. My mother's family wanted me to marry a man 40 years my senior to settle the accounts. I took what little money I had and bought a ticket west, as far from Philadelphia as the railroads and stage coaches would take me. I'm a trained teacher, so I'm hoping to find work at the schoolhouse here if they'll have me." "We have a school," Ethan said. "The teacher we had last year went back east after the winter. Said the altitude gave her headaches and the isolation drove her to distraction. The school board's been looking for a replacement since spring." "Then perhaps we're both looking for redemption," Zara said, and when she smiled at him, it was small and tentative but genuine, and Ethan felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. True to prediction, Ethan's father arrived within the hour, driving a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. Jacob Ellis was 62 years old with a beard gone completely gray and eyes the same blue as his son's. He climbed down from the wagon with the stiffness of arthritis and old injuries, but his handshake was still firm when Ethan introduced him to Zara. "Miss Bennett is looking for lodging, Pa," Ethan said carefully. "I suggested she might use Ma's old rooms if that's acceptable to you." Jacob's bushy eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline, and he gave his son a long, measuring look that seemed to take in the absence of whiskey smell, the relative steadiness of his hands, and the earnest hope in his expression. Then he turned to Zara and touched the brim of his hat. "Your mother's rooms have been closed up for 5 years, but I kept them clean in case. They're good rooms, Miss Bennett, with a separate entrance and a sturdy lock. My son may look like something the cat dragged in, but he's telling you true about them being safe and proper." "I appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Ellis," Zara said, "and I'm prepared to pay fair rent once I secure employment." "We can discuss that later," Jacob said gruffly. "For now, let's get you settled. The afternoon's waning and you look like you've had a long journey." They loaded Zara's carpet bag into the wagon along with Jacob's supplies, and Ethan helped her up onto the bench seat before climbing into the back himself. The ride out to the Ellis ranch took them through stands of aspen and pine, past the scars of played-out mining claims and the occasional cabin clinging to a hillside. The elevation here was over 10,000 feet, and the air was thin enough to leave newcomers breathless until their bodies adjusted. Zara sat quietly beside Jacob, her hands gripping the edge of the bench as the wagon jolted over the rough track. Ethan watched her from behind, seeing how she took in every detail of the landscape with alert interest rather than the fear or disgust some Eastern women showed when confronted with the raw wilderness. She asked Jacob intelligent questions about the ranch, the town, the mining operations, and Jacob answered with increasing warmth, clearly pleased to find someone interested in more than just gold dust and claims. The Ellis ranch sprawled across a mountain valley, with grazing land for cattle and horses, and a sturdy log house that Jacob had built with his own hands 25 years earlier. It was more successful than most ranches this high in the mountains, primarily because Jacob had wisely diversified, breeding horses that could handle the altitude, and selling them to miners and the cavalry, rather than relying solely on cattle. As they pulled up to the house, Ethan felt a wave of shame at how much he had let the place deteriorate. Fences needed mending, the barn roof had a visible gap where shingles had blown off in the spring winds, and the vegetable garden his mother had tended so carefully was now mostly weeds. Jacob had done what he could alone, but he was getting old, and one man couldn't manage everything. "It's beautiful," Zara said softly, and Ethan realized she wasn't seeing the disrepair. She was looking at the mountains rising in every direction, their peaks still touched with snow even in July, at the way the evening light turned the aspens to gold and made the meadow grass glow. "I've never seen anything like this." "Your rooms are through here," Jacob said, leading her around the side of the house to a door that opened into what had been his wife's personal sanctuary. Martha Ellis had been a woman who needed her own space, and Jacob had loved her enough to build it for her. 2 rooms with large windows facing the mountains, a small stove for heat, and furniture he had crafted himself from pine and aspen. Ethan hung back as his father showed Zara the rooms, painfully aware of how he must appear to her in the growing twilight. When Jacob lit the lamps, warm light spilled across floors that were indeed clean if a bit dusty, and over furniture that still held the faint scent of the lavender his mother had loved. "It's perfect," Zara said, setting down her carpet bag with visible relief. "Thank you both. I can't tell you how grateful I am." "You'll join us for supper, I hope," Jacob said. "It won't be fancy, but there's venison stew and biscuits." "I would be honored," Zara replied. After she had a chance to wash up and change into a fresh dress, they gathered in the main house's kitchen, a large room dominated by a massive stove and a rough-hewn table that could seat a dozen people. Ethan found himself acutely self-conscious as he ladled stew into bowls, aware that his hands still trembled slightly and that his appearance was still disreputable. While Zara had been settling in, he had at least washed his face and hands, but there hadn't been time to do anything about his hair or beard. The stew was simple but good, thick with vegetables from the root cellar and chunks of tender venison. They ate in a silence that was almost companionable, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls and Jacob's occasional comments about the ranch and the town. "The school board meets Tuesday evenings at the church," Jacob said to Zara. "If you're serious about the teaching position, I can introduce you to Reverend Matthews. He heads up the board and has final say on hiring. I would appreciate that very much, Zara said. I have letters of reference from the school where I taught in Philadelphia, and I've been teaching since I was 18. I'm qualified in all the standard subjects, plus music and basic Latin. Latin, Jacob repeated, shaking his head with amusement. I doubt the mining families will care much about Latin, but the rest should serve well enough. Most of the children here get pulled out of school by 12 to work the claims with their fathers, but the younger ones deserve a proper education same as anyone. After supper, Ethan walked Zara back to her rooms, carrying a lamp to light the way. The mountain darkness was absolute, unmarred by any lights except their own and the distant stars that seemed close enough to touch in the thin air. Your father is a good man, Zara said as they reached her door. The best I know, Ethan agreed. He deserved better than a drunk for a son these past 3 years. You're not drunk now. No, Ethan said and realized with a start that it was true. The whole evening had passed without him once reaching for a bottle or feeling the desperate craving that usually consumed him by this hour. I'm not. Zara looked up at him in the lamplight, her green eyes searching his face. Why did it stop, really? Because I find it hard to believe that one glimpse of a stranger could undo 3 years of grief and guilt. Ethan thought about it carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer. I think I was drowning, and I'd given up on ever reaching the surface. Then you stepped off that coach, and somehow I could see the light above the water again. It didn't undo anything. The grief's still there and the guilt. But suddenly, I had a reason to try swimming instead of just letting myself sink. That's a lot of weight to put on someone you just met, Zara said quietly. I know, and I'm not asking you to carry it. I'm grateful you gave me a reason to try. She studied him for a long moment, then reached out and squeezed his hand briefly. Get some sleep, Ethan Ellis. And tomorrow, maybe cut that hair. You look like a mountain man. He laughed, surprised by the sound. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed. Yes, madam. That night, lying in his own bed in the small room he had occupied since childhood, Ethan stared at the ceiling and waited for the shakes to start, for the sweating and nausea that he knew came with sudden sobriety. His body had been pickled in alcohol for 3 years. Stopping cold should have laid him out with sickness. But the symptoms never came. His hands remained steady, his stomach calm, as though his body had been waiting for his mind to make this decision and had met him halfway. He thought about Zara sleeping in his mother's rooms, about the way lamplight had caught in her dark hair and turned her eyes luminous. He thought about the fact that she was educated and cultured, from a world completely different from his own, and that he had no business feeling what he was beginning to feel. But he thought most of all about the way she had looked at him without pity, only curiosity and a kind of wary respect, as though she saw something in him worth noticing despite the wreck he had made of himself. Before dawn, he rose and found his father's shaving kit. The mirror showed him a stranger, gaunt and hollow-eyed, with 3 years of hard living etched into features that had once been handsome. He cut away the tangled beard carefully, nicking himself twice but persisting until his face was clean-shaven and he could see the shape of his jaw again. The hair was harder, but he managed to trim it to something approaching respectability, until he looked less like a prospector gone feral and more like the rancher's son he had once been. When he emerged from his room, his father was already in the kitchen starting breakfast. Jacob stopped what he was doing and stared at his son for a long moment, his weathered face working through several emotions before settling on something that might have been hope. Well, Jacob said gruffly, there you are. Here I am, Ethan agreed, and set about helping with breakfast without being asked, falling into routines he hadn't followed in 3 years. They were just sitting down to eat when there was a knock at the door. Zara stood on the threshold in a simple gray dress, her hair pinned up in a neat bun, looking rested despite the journey and the strangeness of her new surroundings. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I smelled coffee and thought I would inquire about breakfast, but if you prefer I can make my own arrangements." "Nonsense," Jacob said immediately. "Set another place, Ethan. Miss Bennett's part of this household now, at least until she decides otherwise." Over breakfast they made plans. Jacob would introduce Zara to Reverend Matthews tomorrow, which being Sunday would be easy enough since the whole town turned out for services. Ethan would spend the day starting repairs on the most urgent projects around the ranch, beginning with the barn roof before the next storm hit. It felt strange to be making plans, to be thinking beyond the next bottle, but it also felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. "Can I help with anything?" Zara asked. "I'm afraid I don't know much about ranching, but I'm willing to learn, and I'd prefer to be useful while I'm staying here." "The garden's gone to seed," Jacob said carefully. "Martha put a lot of work into that garden, and I haven't had the heart to tend it proper since she passed. If you wanted to try reclaiming it, I'd be grateful, but it's hard work, and no one would think less of you for declining." Zara's eyes lit up. "I'd love to. My mother had a garden in Philadelphia, just a small city plot, but I helped her with it. I've missed having my hands in the soil." So they each set about their tasks, and the day passed in productive work that left Ethan exhausted in a good way, his muscles aching from real labor instead of the poisonous fatigue of constant drunkenness. He managed to patch the barn roof and mend 2 sections of fence, and when he came in for the midday meal, he found Zara kneeling in the garden with dirt on her skirts, and her sleeves rolled up, working at the weeds with determined efficiency. "You'll want gloves," he said, and she looked up with a smile that made his heart stutter. "I found some in the shed," she said, holding up hands encased in leather work gloves far too large for her. "And I've made good progress, I think. Your mother knew what she was doing when she laid out this garden. The bones of it are still good." Ethan crouched down beside her, examining her work. She had cleared nearly a quarter of the plot already, pulling weeds and separating out the stubborn volunteer vegetables that had somehow survived years of neglect. "You do good work, Miss Bennett." "Zara," she said, "if we're going to be living in close quarters, we should probably use first names." "Zara," he repeated, liking the way it felt in his mouth. "I'm glad you're here." She sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of hair off her forehead with the back of one gloved hand. "I'm glad I'm here too, this place. It feels like breathing after being held underwater." "I know exactly what you mean," Ethan said softly. That evening after supper, Jacob pulled out his old fiddle and played a few tunes while Zara and Ethan cleaned up the dishes. The music filled the house with something it had been missing, a sense of life and warmth that even Martha's death hadn't completely extinguished, but that Ethan's drinking had nearly snuffed out. When Jacob launched into a lively reel, Zara laughed and clapped along, and Ethan found himself grinning like a fool. Sunday morning they rode into town in the wagon, Ethan driving with Zara beside him and Jacob in the back. The church was a simple white building at the north end of Main Street, its bell tower visible from anywhere in Fairplay. Most of the town's respectable citizens attended services, which made it an excellent place for Zara to meet potential employers and establish herself as someone serious and proper. Reverend Matthews was a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and a booming voice that seemed too large for his frame. He greeted Zara with genuine warmth when Jacob introduced them, and his face brightened further when he learned she was a teacher. "This is providential," he declared. "We've been desperate for someone qualified. The children have been running wild since Miss Peterson left, and their parents are beside themselves. Can you start tomorrow? Zara blinked at the speed of the offer. Don't you want to see my references, or observe me teaching? My dear woman, you're educated, you're willing, and you're here. That makes you the most qualified candidate we've had in months. We'll pay $40 a month plus room and board, but I see the Ellises have already provided the latter. Say yes, please, before you come to your senses and run back east. Zara laughed, a clear, bright sound that made several people turn to look. Then yes, Reverend, I accept, thank you. The service that followed was interminable in the way of all church services, but Ethan found he didn't mind. He sat beside Zara in the pew, acutely aware of her presence, of the way she sang the hymns in a clear soprano that blended beautifully with the other voices. People kept glancing their way, curious about the new woman in town, and surprised to see Ethan Ellis sober and clean-shaven, and sitting in church for the first time in 3 years. After the service, they were surrounded by people wanting to meet Zara and express their approval of her appointment. Mothers brought their children forward to introduce them to their new teacher, and Zara handled each introduction with gracious patience, learning names and asking gentle questions that put the shyest children at ease. Well, she's made quite an impression, Jacob said quietly to Ethan as they watched her interact with a gaggle of excited students. Question is, have you thought about what comes next? What do you mean? Don't play dense with me, boy. I see the way you look at her. And I see the way she looks at you when she thinks no one's watching. But she's a lady with education and refinement, and you're trying, and I'm proud of you for that. But you've got a long way to go before you're the man you could be. Ethan's jaw tightened. I know that, Pa. I'm not presuming anything. Good, Jacob said, but not unkindly. Just make sure you're getting sober for yourself, not just for her, because if you're only doing it to win her affections, it won't last. You need to want to be better for your own sake first. The words stung because they were true. That night, lying in bed, Ethan examined his motivations carefully. The craving for alcohol still hadn't returned, which seemed impossible but undeniable. His hands remained steady, his mind clear. But was Jacob right? Was he staying sober only because of Zara? He thought about Samuel, about the weight of guilt he had carried for 3 years. He thought about the ranch falling into disrepair, about his father aging and struggling alone. He thought about the man he had been before the mine collapse, someone who had taken pride in his work and his family, who had been known for his skill with horses and his honest dealings. That man had been worth something. The drunk he had become was worth nothing. Zara had been the catalyst, true enough. But what she had sparked was a desire to be worthy of still being alive when Samuel wasn't, to honor the life his brother had saved by actually living it instead of drowning it. If she never looked at him with anything more than friendship, he would survive that. But he couldn't survive going back to the man he had been before she arrived. The school was a one-room building near the church, with a cast-iron stove for winter heat and windows that let in the brilliant mountain light. When Ethan drove Zara into town Monday morning, she was clutching a worn leather satchel that held her teaching materials and reference books, her face a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "You'll be wonderful," Ethan assured her as he helped her down from the wagon. "Those children are lucky to have you." "I hope you're right," she said. "It's been 6 months since I taught a class, and I've never taught in a place like this. Philadelphia children are different." "Children are children," Ethan said. "They just want someone who cares about them and believes they can learn. You'll give them that." She squeezed his hand briefly. "Thank you. Will you be here to collect me this afternoon, 3 o'clock sharp?" he promised. He spent the day working on the ranch, repairing more fence line, and beginning the process of sorting through the tack room, which had become a disaster of tangled leather and rusting metal during his years of neglect. Jacob worked alongside him, and they fell into the comfortable rhythm they had once shared, before grief had driven a wedge between them. "You know," Jacob said as they broke for lunch, "I blamed myself for Samuel's death too." Ethan looked up sharply. They had never talked about this, not once in 3 years. "Why would you blame yourself? You weren't even there." "I was the one who encouraged him to work in the mines. He wanted to stay on the ranch, help me with the horses, but I told him he needed to make his own way, earn his own money. I pushed him toward the Excelsior and it killed him." Jacob's voice was rough with old pain. "But blaming ourselves doesn't bring him back, son. It just wastes the life we still have." "I was supposed to be there instead of him," Ethan said quietly. "He died in my place, Pa." "And you think he'd want you to spend the rest of your life drunk because of it?" "Samuel loved you, Ethan. He covered for you that morning because he was your little brother, and that's what little brothers do. Dying for it was cruel fate, but it wasn't your fault any more than it was mine for sending him to the mines in the first place." The words settled something in Ethan's chest, though they didn't erase the guilt entirely. Maybe they never would, but perhaps that was all right. Perhaps he could carry the guilt and still choose to live, to be better, to honor Samuel's memory by being the kind of man his brother had believed him to be. When Ethan arrived at the school at 3 o'clock, he found Zara surrounded by children who were clearly reluctant to let her go. She was laughing at something one of the older girls had said, her face flushed with happiness, and Ethan felt something in his chest expand painfully. "How was it?" he asked once the children had finally dispersed, and she climbed up beside him in the wagon. "Exhausting," she said. "Challenging." "Wonderful. I have students ranging from 5 years old to 14, all in one room, all at different levels. Half of them can barely read, and the other half are so hungry for knowledge they bombard me with questions about everything under the sun. It's going to be incredibly difficult, and I already love it." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Ethan found himself grinning as he drove them back toward the ranch. They talked about her day, about the children and their families, about the curriculum she wanted to implement and the supplies she would need. She had a vision for what education could mean even in a rough mining town, and her passion for it shone through every word. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "How was your day? Fixed fence, sorted tack, had a conversation with my father that was 3 years overdue," Ethan said. "It was a good day." "I'm glad," Zara said softly, and something in her voice made him glance over at her. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something warm and complicated that made his heart beat faster. The days settled into a pattern. Ethan rose before dawn to help his father with the ranch work, drove Zara into town for school, worked through the day, collected her in the afternoon, and spent the evenings in companionable domesticity with her and Jacob. It was a simple life, but it was a good life, and Ethan felt himself healing in ways he hadn't known were possible. He still thought about drinking sometimes, usually in the dark hours before dawn when old memories surfaced unbidden. But the craving never returned with any real force. As though his body and mind had made a permanent decision that night, he dropped the bottle. He went to church on Sundays, started rebuilding friendships he had destroyed during his drinking years, and slowly began to recognize himself in the mirror again. Zara thrived as well. The children adored her, and within weeks she had organized a proper curriculum, started a small lending library with books she ordered from Denver, and even begun giving evening classes for adults who wanted to improve their reading skills. She attacked every challenge with the same determined enthusiasm she had brought to clearing the garden, and Ethan found himself falling more in love with her every day. Because it was love, he finally admitted to himself one evening in late August as he watched her teaching Jacob how to play chess in the lamplight. It wasn't just gratitude for being the catalyst for his sobriety or attraction to her beauty, though she was beautiful. It was the way she approached life with courage and intelligence, the way she was kind to everyone but took nonsense from no one, the way she hummed while working in the garden and laughed at Jacob's terrible jokes and looked at Ethan sometimes with an expression that made him dare to hope she might feel the same way. But he held back from saying anything, aware that Jacob was right about him having a long way to go. He had been sober for 2 months, which was good but hardly proved he could maintain it. He needed to show her, and himself, that he was truly reliable before he could ask her to consider any kind of future with him. September brought the first hard freeze, a reminder that winter came early and stayed late at this elevation. The aspen leaves turned gold seemingly overnight, and the mountains blazed with color against the deep blue sky. Zara stood in the garden one afternoon, looking at the vegetables she had coaxed back to life, and sighed. "We need to harvest everything this week," she said when Ethan came to find her. "The next freeze will kill it all." "I'll help," he said. "After school tomorrow, we'll bring in whatever's ready." They worked together in the golden afternoon light, filling baskets with squash and potatoes, carrots and turnips, the last of the beans and the tough mountain lettuce. Zara's face was flushed with exertion, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek that Ethan wanted to wipe away but didn't quite dare. "Your mother must have loved this," Zara said, looking around at the reclaimed garden with satisfaction. "There's something so hopeful about growing things at this elevation, where everything is working against you." She said it reminded her that beauty and goodness can flourish anywhere if you're stubborn enough, Ethan said. "She was a lot like you, actually. Determined and smart and not afraid of hard work." Zara looked at him with surprise. "That's the first time you've really talked about her." "I know. It hurt too much for a long time, and then I was too drunk to talk about anything that mattered, but I think she would have liked you. And I know she would be glad you brought her garden back to life." "I hope so," Zara said quietly. "I felt close to her here, working in the soil she tended. It's strange, feeling connected to someone I never met." They carried the harvest into the house, where Jacob helped them sort through everything and begin the process of storing it for winter. The root cellar was deep enough to stay above freezing even in the worst cold, and soon its shelves were lined with the fruits of Zara's labor. That night after supper, as had become their custom, they sat together in the main room while Jacob played his fiddle, and Zara worked on mending or planning lessons. Ethan usually repaired tack or carved small projects from wood, but tonight he found himself just watching her in the firelight, memorizing the curve of her cheek and the way her lashes cast shadows when she bent over her work. She looked up and caught him staring. "What are you thinking about?" The truth rose to his lips before he could stop it. "How beautiful you are, and how grateful I am that you came here." Color flooded her cheeks, and she set down her mending. Jacob, bless him, chose that moment to suddenly remember urgent business in the barn and made himself scarce with transparent haste. "Ethan," Zara said carefully, "we should talk about this." His heart sank. "You're going to tell me you don't feel the same way?" "No," she said, and his heart lifted again, soaring. "I'm going to tell you that I do feel the same way, and that terrifies me." He moved to sit beside her on the sofa, close enough to touch but not quite touching. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because I came here to escape one trap, and I don't want to fall into another. Because I've only known you for 2 months, and 2 months ago you were a drunk who couldn't go an hour without a bottle. Because I'm afraid that if I let myself love you, You'll decide sobriety is too hard and go back to the man you were, and I'll be left heartbroken in the middle of nowhere with no way out." The honesty of it hit him like a blow, but he understood. Those are all fair concerns. "I know I'm being calculating and cold about this," Zara continued, her voice shaking slightly. "But I have to be. I can't afford to make mistakes, Ethan. I have no family to fall back on, no money, no safety net. If I give you my heart and you break it, I'm left with nothing." "Then I won't break it," Ethan said simply. "I know I can't prove that to you yet. I know 2 months isn't long enough to trust that I'll stay sober. But I swear to you, Zara, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for myself because I finally want to live again instead of just existing. You made me see that was possible, but you're not responsible for maintaining it." She searched his face in the firelight, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "I want to believe you. Then take your time believing me. I'm not going anywhere. I'll prove it to you day by day, month by month, however long it takes." "What if it takes years?" she whispered. "Then it takes years. You're worth waiting for, Zara Bennett." She leaned forward and kissed him then, soft and tentative and sweet, and Ethan felt the world rearrange itself around that single point of contact. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "I'm still scared," she admitted. "So am I," he said, "but I think that's all right. We can be scared together." They sat together on the sofa until Jacob returned from the barn, talking quietly about hopes and fears and the future they might build if they were brave enough to try. It wasn't a commitment or a promise, but it was a beginning, and that was enough for now. October brought the first real snow, huge wet flakes that blanketed Fairplay overnight and turned the mountains into a wonderland of white and blue. Zara's students were beside themselves with excitement, and she finally gave up on teaching and let them spend the afternoon building snowmen in the schoolyard while she supervised from the steps. Ethan arrived to collect her and found her pelting a group of older boys with snowballs, laughing as they returned fire with terrible aim. She looked younger in that moment, carefree and joyful, and he thought about the serious Eastern woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 3 months ago and marveled at the transformation. Having fun. He called, and she turned to grin at him, her hair escaping its pins and her cheeks bright red from cold and exertion. "Loads," she said breathlessly. "Though I may have started a war I can't win." "Then it's time for a tactical retreat," Ethan said, and scooped her up without warning, carrying her to the wagon while she shrieked with laughter and the children cheered. He set her down on the bench seat and she swatted his arm, still giggling. That was completely unnecessary. "But effective," he pointed out, climbing up beside her and taking the reins. They drove through the snow-covered landscape, and Zara sighed with contentment. "I love it here. I know that's probably strange to say after only 3 months, but I feel like I've found where I belong." "It's not strange at all," Ethan said. "I felt the same way the day you arrived, like something had clicked into place that I didn't even know was missing." She leaned against his shoulder, and they rode in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crunch of wagon wheels on snow and the breathing of the horses. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. That evening they had a visitor. Michael Thompson, who owned the neighboring ranch to the north, rode up just as they were finishing supper. He was a good man in his early 30s, recently widowed, with 2 young children who attended Zara's school. "Sorry to intrude," Michael said after accepting Jacob's invitation to come in and warm up. "But I wanted to thank Miss Bennett personally for what she's done with my boys. They've learned more in 3 months with her than in the whole previous year. Emma and Thomas actually look forward to school now. They're bright children," Zara said warmly. "It's a pleasure to teach them." "Well, I'm grateful all the same," Michael said, "and I wanted to extend an invitation. A few of us ranchers are getting together next Saturday for a barn dance at the Porter place. Music, food, a chance to socialize before winter really sets in. I'd be honored if you all would attend, and especially if Miss Bennett would save me a dance." Ethan felt a stab of jealousy so sharp it surprised him. Michael was handsome and successful, a widower in need of a wife and mother for his children, exactly the kind of stable prospect any sensible woman would consider. He forced himself to smile and nod, even as his hands clenched beneath the table. "That sounds lovely," Zara said, either oblivious to or ignoring the tension. "We'd be happy to attend." After Michael left, Jacob immediately excused himself to bed with a poorly suppressed grin, leaving Ethan and Zara alone. She looked at him with raised eyebrows. "Are you going to tell me what that was about, or are you going to sit there glowering all evening?" "I wasn't glowering." "You absolutely were. The moment Michael asked me to dance, you looked like you wanted to throw him off the mountain." Ethan stood up and paced to the window, staring out at the snow-covered darkness. "He's a good man. Stable, successful, respectable. Everything I'm trying to become, but not there yet." Zara came to stand beside him, her reflection joining his in the dark glass. "And you think I want him instead of you? I think you should probably consider it. You said yourself you need security. Michael could give you that tomorrow." "I'm still just a former drunk trying to prove I won't backslide." She turned to face him directly, her eyes flashing with something between anger and exasperation. "First of all, you are not just anything. You're a man who faced his demons and chose to fight them, which takes more courage than most people will ever have. Second, I'm not interested in Michael Thompson, no matter how stable and respectable he is. I'm interested in you, Ethan Ellis, and I'm getting rather tired of you trying to convince me I shouldn't be." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking loose something that had been held tight in his chest. "I just don't understand why you would choose me when you could have better." "Because I don't want better, you infuriating man. I want you. The real you, flaws and struggles and all. Not some perfect version that doesn't exist, not some stable widower looking for a convenient mother for his children. You. Is that finally clear enough for you?" Instead of answering with words, Ethan pulled her into his arms and kissed her the way he had been wanting to kiss her for months, deep and passionate and claiming. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt, and when they finally broke apart they were both breathing hard. "I love you," Ethan said, the words tumbling out helplessly. "I've been trying not to say it because it seemed too soon and too much, but I love you, Zara. I love your determination and your kindness and the way you make everything better just by being present. I love how you brought my mother's garden back to life and how you never look at me with pity even though you have every right to. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of that." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "I love you too. I've been terrified to admit it, but I do. I love your honesty and your strength and the way you get up every day and choose to be better even though it would be so much easier to give up. I love how you look at me like I'm something precious, and I love your terrible jokes and the way you're patient with your father even when he's being difficult. I love you, Ethan, and I'm choosing to trust that we can build something real together." They held each other in the lamp-lit kitchen, swaying slightly as though dancing to music only they could hear, and Ethan felt a peace settle over him that he had never expected to experience again. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew that. There would be hard days and temptations and moments when staying sober felt impossible. But with Zara beside him, he finally believed he could face those challenges without running back to the bottle. The barn dance the following Saturday was exactly the kind of community gathering that made frontier life bearable through long winters. The Porter Ranch had a huge barn that had been cleared of hay and livestock for the occasion, with lanterns strung from the rafters and sawdust spread on the floor for dancing. Families arrived from miles around, bringing covered dishes and instruments, and soon the barn was warm with bodies and bright with laughter. Zara wore a dress of deep blue that Ethan had never seen before, and she was immediately surrounded by people wanting to talk to the popular new schoolteacher. He watched her handle the attention with grace, smiling and chatting while keeping him in her peripheral vision, always aware of where he was in the crowd. Michael Thompson did indeed ask her to dance, and Ethan forced himself to stand still and watch without interfering. She accepted politely but kept the conversation light and friendly, nothing more, and when the dance ended she made her way straight back to Ethan's side. "Your turn," she said, taking his hand. They moved onto the floor for a lively reel, and Ethan was surprised to find he remembered the steps from before his drinking years, when he had been a regular at these community gatherings. They spun and stepped through the patterns, breathless and laughing, and when the dance ended they stayed on the floor for the next one, a slower waltz that allowed them to actually talk. "Everyone's staring at us," Zara murmured against his ear. "Let them stare. They're probably just surprised to see me upright and sober. Or they're noticing that we're clearly besotted with each other and making bets on how long until we marry." Ethan's heart skipped. Would that be so terrible? She pulled back to look at him, her green eyes serious. "No. But I think we should give it time. Make sure this is real and lasting before we make promises we might not be able to keep." "How much time?" "Ask me again in the spring," she said. "If we make it through a Colorado winter together, we can probably survive anything." It was fair, and Ethan nodded his agreement even as part of him wanted to propose right there on the dance floor. But she was right to be cautious, and he respected her for it. They had both been through enough to know that feelings, no matter how intense, needed to be tested against time and reality before being made permanent. The winter that followed was indeed brutal, with snow measured in feet rather than inches and temperatures that regularly dropped below zero. The school was sometimes forced to close for days at a time when the roads became impassable, and Zara would work on lessons by lamplight in the main house, refusing to stay isolated in her own rooms when the wind howled like a living thing outside the walls. Ethan spent those long winter days working with his father to keep the ranch functioning, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling hay to cattle that couldn't forage through the deep snow, and making sure the horses stayed healthy and fed. It was hard work that left him exhausted by nightfall, but it was honest exhaustion that felt good in his bones on Christmas Eve. A blizzard moved in that lasted 3 days, trapping them completely on the ranch. They spent the time in front of the fire, playing cards and telling stories, and on Christmas morning, Zara gave Ethan a new wool scarf she had knitted in secret, while he gave her a box he had carved from aspen wood and lined with cedar, perfect for keeping letters or small treasures. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Did you make this?" "I used to be pretty good at woodworking before. I'm rusty now, but I wanted to make you something with my own hands." She kissed him sweetly, not caring that Jacob was sitting right there watching them with a pleased grin. "It's perfect, thank you." January and February passed in a blur of cold and snow, and the strange, timeless quality that winter brings to places where the world narrows to the small circle of lamplight and the warmth of fire. Ethan marked each day without alcohol as a victory, and by the time March arrived with its promise of eventual thaw, he had been sober for 8 months. The first real sign of spring came in late March, when the snow began to melt in earnest and the creeks ran high with runoff. Zara's garden began to emerge from its white blanket, showing the bones of last year's work and the promise of this year's planting. She stood looking at it one afternoon, her expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, coming to stand beside her. "That I want to plant more this year, expand the beds, add some herbs and flowers along with the vegetables, make it even more beautiful than before." That sounds like the plan of someone expecting to be here for a while. She turned to him with a smile. "Well, we did make it through the winter together. I think that means we can survive just about anything." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Does that mean you'll give me an answer if I ask you the question I've been waiting to ask since December?" "That depends on the question," she said, but her eyes were dancing. He took both her hands in his, suddenly nervous despite the fact that he knew what her answer would be. "Zara Bennett, you walked into my life when I was at my absolute lowest, and you gave me a reason to climb back up. You didn't save me, I had to do that myself. But you made me want to be saved, want to be better, want to have a future worth living. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said simply, and then laughed at the relief that must have shown on his face. "Did you really think I would say no? I thought there was a possibility you had come to your senses and realized you could do better." She pulled him down for a kiss that left no doubt about her feelings on the matter. "I told you before, Ethan Ellis, I don't want better. I want you." They were married in early May when the aspens were just beginning to leaf out and the meadows were carpeted with wildflowers. The whole town turned out for the ceremony at the little white church, and Reverend Matthews beamed as though he had personally arranged the match. Zara wore a simple dress of white cotton that she had sewn herself, with wildflowers woven into her dark hair, and Ethan thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Jacob stood as his best man, tears running unashamedly down his weathered cheeks, while one of Zara's students served as flower girl, taking her duties with solemn seriousness. The vows they spoke were traditional but felt profound in that moment, promises about sickness and health, good times and bad, till death parted them. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the meadow and everyone bringing food to share. There was music and dancing and toasts that ranged from heartfelt to hilarious. And as the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ethan held his wife close and marveled at how much his life had changed in less than a year. "Happy?" Zara asked, her head on his shoulder as they swayed to the fiddle music. "Happier than I ever thought I would be again," he said honestly. "A year ago I was drowning and now I'm here, married to you, sober and whole. It doesn't seem real sometimes." "It's real," she assured him. "We made it real together." They spent their wedding night in the main house, since Jacob had moved himself to the bunkhouse for the occasion with much grumbling about being exiled from his own home. But in the morning he was back for breakfast, pretending nothing had changed even as everything had changed over the following months. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Zara continued teaching while expanding the garden even further, creating a space that became known throughout the area for its beauty and productivity. Ethan worked the ranch with renewed purpose, and under his care it began to thrive again, with healthy herds and horses that were sought after as far away as Denver. He still thought about drinking sometimes, usually when something reminded him sharply of Samuel or when stress mounted high. But the thoughts were fleeting now, shadows that passed quickly instead of darkness that threatened to engulf him. Zara knew when those moments hit him, and she would simply be there, a steady presence that reminded him why staying sober mattered. In October, nearly a year and a half after she had arrived in Fairplay, Zara told him she was pregnant. They were in the garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first hard freeze, when she suddenly sat back on her heels and said, "I have something to tell you." The serious tone made him pause in his work. "What is it?" "I'm expecting a baby. Due in May, I think." Joy flooded through him so intensely it left him dizzy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break, though he knew better. Zara was strong as mountain granite beneath her refined exterior. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I've suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I told you. Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said, pulling back to look at her face. Terrified, thrilled, grateful. "You're going to be an amazing mother. And you're going to be an amazing father," she said firmly. "Don't even start doubting that." They told Jacob that evening, and the old man actually whooped with joy before pulling them both into a fierce hug. "A grandchild," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Martha would have been so happy. She always wanted a house full of grandchildren. Zara taught through the winter, her pregnancy progressing without major complications despite the challenges of the altitude and the cold. By March, she was too large to comfortably make the trip into town every day. So she reluctantly took a leave from teaching, promising her students she would return the following fall. The baby arrived on a warm May evening in 1878, 2 years almost to the day after Ethan and Zara's wedding. The birth was long and difficult, and Ethan spent hours pacing the floor while the midwife from town worked behind the closed door of their bedroom. Jacob sat with him, offering silent support, and when the baby's first cry finally split the air, Ethan nearly collapsed with relief. "You have a son," the midwife announced, opening the door with a tired smile. "A big, healthy boy, and your wife did wonderfully." Ethan stumbled into the room to find Zara propped up against the pillows, sweaty and exhausted but radiant, holding a red-faced infant who was squalling his displeasure at being born. She looked up at Ethan with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Meet Samuel," she said softly. "Samuel Jacob Ellis." The name hit Ethan like a blow, and he had to sit down on the edge of the bed before his legs gave out. "You want to name him after my brother? I want to honor the person whose death brought you so low and whose memory helped bring you back up again," Zara said. "If that's all right with you." "It's perfect," Ethan managed, reaching out to touch his son's tiny hand. Little Samuel immediately gripped his finger with surprising strength, and Ethan felt his heart expand so much it physically hurt. "Hey there, little man. Welcome to the world." The first months of fatherhood were a blur of sleepless nights and constant worry, but also joy so profound. It changed everything Ethan thought he understood about love. He would watch Zara nursing their son in the lamplight and feel overwhelmed by the family they had created, by how close he had come to missing all of this, because he had been too lost in grief and alcohol to imagine a future. On the second anniversary of the day, Zara had arrived in Fairplay. Ethan walked out to the spot where he had been standing when he first saw her step off that stagecoach. Young Samuel was sleeping peacefully in the house, watched over by his doting grandfather, and Zara stood beside Ethan with her hand in his. 2 years, she said quietly. "Can you believe it?" "Some days yes, some days no," Ethan admitted. "There are still moments when I wake up and expect to find out this has all been a dream, that I'm still drunk in some saloon somewhere and none of this is real." "It's real," Zara said, squeezing his hand. "Look at everything we've built. The ranch is thriving, the garden is beautiful, we have a healthy son, and you've been sober for 2 full years. That's not a dream, Ethan. That's what you made happen by choosing to keep fighting every single day." "We made it happen," he corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Maybe," she allowed. "But you did the hardest part, which was deciding you wanted to change. I just gave you a reason to see that change was possible." They stood together watching the mountains turn gold in the sunset, and Ethan thought about the man he had been 2 years ago, hollow and broken and convinced his life was over. That man had dropped a bottle and found salvation in the arrival of a stranger who became his reason to fight. But the man he was now understood that she hadn't saved him. She had simply shown him he was worth saving, and that had made all the difference. Little Samuel grew into a sturdy toddler with his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn determination. He learned to walk by pulling himself up on the furniture and fence rails, and his first word was "Pa," which made Ethan's heart swell with pride every time he heard it. Zara returned to teaching when Samuel was 6 months old, bringing him to school with her and letting the older girls take turns minding him while she taught. The arrangement worked surprisingly well, and Samuel became the unofficial mascot of the Fairplay school. When Samuel was 2, Zara announced she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1880 they welcomed a daughter they named Martha Rose, after Ethan's mother and Zara's love of the wild roses that bloomed in the mountains each June. She was smaller than Samuel had been, with dark hair like her mother, and a temperament that was both fierce and sweet. Jacob, now 67, delighted in his grandchildren with an energy that belied his age. He taught young Samuel to ride before the boy was 3, holding him safe on the saddle while they toured the ranch together. And he would sit for hours with baby Martha in his lap, telling her stories about her grandmother and the early days of the ranch. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. The ranch continued to prosper under Ethan's careful management, and Zara's reputation as an exceptional teacher meant the school was always full. They expanded the house to accommodate their growing family, adding rooms and a proper kitchen that Zara had dreamed of since her arrival. Ethan remained sober, though the struggle never entirely disappeared. There were days when the craving would surface unexpectedly, triggered by stress or memory or nothing at all. But he had learned to recognize those moments and weather them, to reach out to Zara or his father, or simply sit with the discomfort until it passed. He attended church regularly, not out of deep religious conviction, but because the community it provided helped anchor him. When Samuel was 5 and Martha was 3, Zara discovered she was pregnant once more. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, leaving her exhausted and sick for months. Ethan worried constantly, but she assured him everything was fine, just her body reminding her she wasn't 22 anymore. The baby came in January of 1883, in the middle of a howling blizzard that made it impossible to fetch the midwife from town. Ethan and Jacob delivered the child themselves, following Zara's gasped instructions while she labored through the pain. It was terrifying and miraculous in equal measure, and when their second son finally emerged, small but healthy, Ethan felt tears streaming down his face. "What should we name him?" Zara asked once the baby was cleaned and nursing. Ethan looked at his father, who was standing in the doorway with wonder on his weathered face. "Jacob," he said. "If that's all right with you, Pa." The old man's eyes filled with tears. "I'd be honored." Young Jacob was a quiet baby, content to observe the world around him with solemn dark eyes. He seemed to take everything in and process it carefully before reacting. A thoughtful soul, even in infancy. Samuel adored his baby brother and insisted on helping with everything, while Martha viewed him with the suspicion of a child who had enjoyed being the baby and wasn't entirely pleased about the change in status. Life continued its steady progress through the 1880s. The children grew and thrived, Samuel becoming a skilled horseman like his grandfather, Martha showing her mother's fierce intelligence and love of learning, and young Jacob developing into a boy who was happiest working with his hands, fixing things and building elaborate structures from whatever materials he could find. Fairplay evolved too, transitioning slowly from a rough mining camp to an established town with proper buildings and infrastructure. The mine still operated, but agriculture and ranching had become equally important to the local economy. Zara's school was now a 2-room building with a second teacher to help manage the growing enrollment, though she remained the head teacher and the heart of the educational community. Jacob Ellis passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1888, at the age of 75. They buried him on the ranch he had built, with a view of the mountains he had loved, and Ethan grieved for the father who had stood by him through his worst years and celebrated his redemption. But it was a clean grief, not the destructive kind that had nearly destroyed him after Samuel's death. He missed his father terribly, but he didn't reach for a bottle. He had Zara and his children to think of, and the ranch to maintain, and a life that was too precious to throw away on old habits. Young Samuel was 13 by then, nearly a man himself, and he stepped up to help his father with the ranch work that Jacob had been doing. The boy had inherited his grandfather's way with horses and his father's determination, and Ethan watched with pride as his son grew into someone capable and honorable. In 1890, 14 years after Zara had arrived in Fairplay, Ethan stood in the garden she had created from wilderness and overgrown weeds. It was full summer, and the space overflowed with vegetables and flowers, exactly as his mother's garden had done decades ago. His children played nearby, Samuel now 15, and taking a rare break from ranch work, Martha at 12 already helping her mother prepare lessons for the fall term, and Jacob at 7 building an elaborate fort from old lumber. Zara came to stand beside him, her hair now touched with gray at the temples but her green eyes as bright as ever. She was 42 now to his 40, and the years had been kind to both of them, weathering them but not hardening them. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "How different my life would be if you hadn't stepped off that stagecoach 14 years ago. How close I came to never knowing any of this." He gestured at the garden, the children, the ranch thriving in the distance. "But you did know it," she said gently. "Because you made the choice to put down that bottle and become the man you are now. I'm proud of you, Ethan. Every single day I'm proud of you." "I'm proud of us," he corrected. "We built this together, Zara. Everything good in my life came from that moment I saw you and decided I wanted to be worthy of even being in your presence." "You were always worthy," she said. "You just had to believe it yourself." They stood together watching their children play, and Ethan thought about the journey that had brought them here. From the depths of alcoholic despair to this moment of complete contentment, from broken and hollow to whole and fulfilled. The road hadn't been easy or straight, and there had been times when staying sober had felt impossible. But he had done it, one day at a time, one choice at a time, building a life he had never imagined he deserved. Young Samuel called out to him, asking for help with one of the horses, and Ethan squeezed Zara's hand before heading toward his son. As he walked across the meadow grass in the mountain sunlight, he felt a profound gratitude for the gift of this life, for the woman who had sparked his redemption, and for the strength he had found within himself to reach for it. He hadn't been sober in 3 years when she arrived, but he had been sober every day since, and that had made all the difference. The years continued to roll forward with the steady inevitability of seasons in the high country. By 1895, Samuel was 20 and running most of the ranch operations himself, having grown into a man who combined his grandfather Jacob's horsemanship with his father's business sense. He had been courting a girl from town, Sarah Mitchell, the daughter of the blacksmith, and Ethan could see in his son's eyes the same devotion he felt for Zara. Martha, at 17, had decided she wanted to attend the new teachers' college that had opened in Denver. It meant she would be away from home for the first time, and both Ethan and Zara struggled with the idea of their daughter leaving the safety of Fairplay. But Martha had inherited her mother's determination and her father's stubborn refusal to give up on dreams, and they ultimately supported her decision. She left that fall with a trunk full of books and dresses, promising to write every week. Young Jacob, now 12, had discovered a talent for working with wood and metal, and spent most of his free time in the workshop Ethan had built for him, creating everything from practical tools to intricate carvings. He was quiet like his grandfather Jacob had been, content in his own company but deeply devoted to his family. Fairplay itself had matured into a real town, with paved streets in the center, a proper hotel, and even telephone lines connecting the major buildings. The mining boom had settled into a sustainable industry, rather than the frenzied rush it had been in the 1870s, and the town had gained stability as a result. Zara's school now had 3 teachers and served students from all the surrounding ranches and settlements. On a crisp October evening in 1896, exactly 20 years after Zara had arrived in Fairplay, Ethan and Zara sat together on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Samuel was preparing for his wedding, which would take place in 2 weeks. Martha had just returned from her first year at college, full of stories and ideas and excitement about teaching. Jacob was in his workshop, the sound of his hammer ringing peacefully through the evening air. 20 years, Zara said softly, echoing the thought that had been running through Ethan's mind. It seems impossible that it's been that long, and at the same time it feels like you've been in my life forever. I was just a drunk cowboy putting down a bottle when you arrived, Ethan said, still awed by the transformation that had occurred. Look at what we built from that. You were never just anything, Zara said firmly, as she had told him countless times over the years. You were a man struggling with grief and guilt, and you found the strength to overcome it. That takes more courage than most people will ever understand. Ethan pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, lavender soap and sunshine. I haven't told you this in a while, but you saved my life that day. Not by doing anything specific, just by being you, by giving me a reason to see that life could be worth living again. And you saved mine, Zara replied. I came here running from a life I didn't want, with no real plan beyond escape. You and your father gave me a home, a purpose, a family. We saved each other, Ethan. That's what love does. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had looked down on them 20 years ago, when Ethan had been at his lowest point, and Zara had been a frightened woman stepping into an unknown future. Those strangers had become partners, lovers, parents, friends, building a life together that had weathered every storm. Do you ever regret it? Ethan asked suddenly. You could have gone anywhere, done anything. You were educated and capable. Instead, you ended up married to a recovering drunk on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. Zara turned to look at him, her green eyes fierce in the twilight. Ethan Ellis, after 20 years of marriage and 3 children and building a life together, if you still think I regret choosing you, then I have failed at communicating my feelings more spectacularly than I thought possible. He laughed, as she had intended. Fair point. I love you, she said simply. I loved you when you were a mess with a beard down to your chest and whiskey on your breath. I loved you when you were terrified you would fail at staying sober. I loved you through every hard moment and every triumph, and I will love you until the day I die. This life, this place, this family we created, it's exactly what I wanted, even if I didn't know it when I stepped off that stagecoach 20 years ago. Samuel's wedding 2 weeks later was a joyous occasion that brought together the entire community. The ceremony took place at the church, followed by a reception at the ranch that lasted well into the night. Sarah Mitchell became Sarah Ellis with a smile bright enough to rival the mountain sun, and Ethan watched his son begin his own adult life with a mixture of pride and bittersweet nostalgia. "He looks happy," Zara murmured, standing beside Ethan as they watched Samuel and Sarah dance. "He looks how I felt on our wedding day," Ethan replied. "Like he can't quite believe his luck." "Genetics," Zara said with a smile. "The Ellis men clearly have excellent taste in women." They danced together as the evening wore on, moving through the same steps they had danced at their own wedding and at countless barn dances and celebrations over the years. Ethan held his wife close and marveled at how time had passed, how the desperate man who had dropped a bottle of whiskey had become this person living this life. In 1898, Martha graduated from Teachers College and surprised them all by announcing she intended to return to Fairplay to teach. "The world is big and full of opportunities," she told them over dinner during her graduation visit. "But this is where I want to be. This is home, and these are the children I want to teach. I want to continue what Mama started." Zara cried, though she tried to hide it, and Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. Their daughter could have taught anywhere, in bigger towns with more prestige and better pay, but she chose to come home. It felt like an affirmation of everything they had built. By the turn of the century, the Ellis family had become a fixture of Fairplay's landscape. Samuel and Sarah had 2 children of their own, making Ethan and Zara grandparents at 48. Martha taught alongside her mother at the school, the 2 of them creating an educational partnership that was the envy of other mountain towns. Jacob, now 16, had opened his own workshop in town, creating custom furniture and tools that were sought after throughout the region. On a warm July evening in 1900, Ethan stood in the rebuilt and expanded garden, now tended by multiple generations of Ellis family members. He was 50 years old, his hair gone gray at the temples and his face marked by years of mountain sun and honest work. But his hands were steady, his mind clear, and his heart full in a way he had never imagined possible during those dark years before Zara arrived. 24 years sober. 24 years of choosing life over oblivion, of building instead of destroying, of love instead of despair. He thought about his brother Samuel, whose death had sent him spiraling into alcoholism, and hoped that wherever his brother was, he could see what Ethan had made of the life he had saved. "There you are," Zara said, joining him in the garden. She was 50 now, her hair more gray than dark, but still beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with the life they had lived together. "Dinner's ready, and your grandchildren are getting impatient." "Grandchildren," Ethan repeated with a shake of his head. "When did we get old enough to have grandchildren?" "Gradually," Zara said with a smile, taking his hand. "Very gradually, and together every step of the way." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and Ethan looked at the warm light spilling from the windows, heard the laughter of his family gathered inside, and felt a contentment so profound it was almost physical. This was his legacy, not the years he had spent drowning in whiskey, but the decades he had spent building something good and lasting. That night, after the family had scattered to their various homes and rooms, Ethan and Zara sat together on their porch as they had done countless times over the years. The mountains rose around them, eternal and beautiful, the same mountains that had witnessed Ethan's lowest point and his slow climb back to life. "I still think about that day sometimes," Ethan said quietly. "The day you arrived. How I dropped that bottle and just knew everything was about to change." "Do you ever miss it? The drinking?" Zara asked. She had asked this question before over the years, always wanting to understand his experience. "Sometimes I miss the oblivion," he admitted. "When something hurts or when I'm stressed, there's still a part of my brain that remembers how alcohol could numb all that. But then I look at what I have, at you and our children and this life, and I know that any temporary relief wouldn't be worth risking all of this. The pain is manageable. Losing you would destroy me." "You're not going to lose me," Zara said firmly. "We're in this together until the end, remember? That's what we promised." "Till death do us part," Ethan quoted from their wedding vows. "And even then I expect to haunt you," Zara said with a smile. "Make sure you're eating properly and not letting the ranch fall into disrepair." Ethan laughed and pulled her close, and they sat together under the stars. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, when both had needed saving and both had been brave enough to reach for it. The years continued their steady march. Samuel and Sarah's family grew to include 4 children, all of whom spent summers at the ranch learning the same skills their father and grandfather had mastered. Martha married a local rancher named Thomas Green in 1902, and they built a home near her parents' ranch, close enough for daily visits but far enough for independence. Jacob married in 1904, a quiet wedding to Clara Porter, whose father owned the ranch where that first barn dance had been held so many years ago. Ethan and Zara aged gracefully together, their love deepening and mellowing like good wine. They had their disagreements and frustrations, as all couples do, but they had learned early to communicate honestly and work through problems, rather than letting them fester. The foundation they had built in those first years, when Zara had been scared to trust, and Ethan had been desperate to prove himself worthy, had held strong through all the challenges life threw at them. In 1910, Fairplay celebrated its 60th anniversary as an incorporated town, and Ethan and Zara were honored as pillars of the community. They stood on a stage in front of most of the town, uncomfortable with the attention but grateful for the recognition of what they had contributed. Zara had taught 3 generations of Fairplay children by then, and Ethan's ranch supplied horses to ranchers and farmers throughout the state. "We came here as strangers," Zara said when asked to speak. "I was running from a life I didn't want, and Ethan was struggling with grief and addiction. But this town, this community, gave us a chance to start over and build something good. Thank you for that gift, and for allowing us to give back over the years." The applause was thunderous, and Ethan saw tears in the eyes of many in the crowd. They knew his story, knew about the 3 years he had spent drunk after his brother's death, and knew about the remarkable transformation that had occurred. He had become proof that redemption was possible, that a person could fall as far as he had fallen and still climb back up to build a meaningful life. By 1915, Ethan was 63 years old and contemplating retirement. Not full retirement, he would never stop working the ranch entirely, but perhaps handing over the daily operations to Samuel, who was 40 and more than capable of running everything himself. Zara had already retired from teaching 2 years earlier, passing the torch to Martha and a new generation of educators. They spent their time gardening, reading, and enjoying their grandchildren, of whom there were now 12 ranging from newborns to 20-year-olds. The ranch had expanded over the years to include not just Samuel's family, but portions deeded to Martha and Jacob as well, creating a compound of Ellis family holdings that stretched across the mountain valley. One evening in late summer, sitting on their porch as the sunset painted the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson. Zara turned to Ethan with a serious expression. "I've been thinking about the future," she said. "About what happens when we're gone." "Cheerful topic," Ethan said with a slight smile, though he understood the need to have this conversation. "I'm serious. We've built something remarkable here, Ethan. Not just the ranch or the family, but a legacy of second chances and redemption. I want to make sure that continues." "What did you have in mind?" "I want to establish a fund, maybe through the church, to help people struggling with alcoholism or other addictions. Not just giving them money, but providing support and opportunities for recovery. Maybe helping them find work or housing, giving them the kind of chance you were given when you decided to get sober." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how different his life might have been if he hadn't had his father's ranch to return to, if he hadn't had a safe place to recover and rebuild. "I think that's a beautiful idea. Samuel would have liked it, knowing his death led to something that helps others." They worked together over the following months to establish the Ellis Family Recovery Fund, endowing it with a significant portion of their savings, and setting up a board of trustees that included Reverend Matthews and several other community leaders. The fund would provide assistance to anyone struggling with addiction who was genuinely committed to recovery, offering everything from job training to temporary housing, to simple financial support during the difficult early months of sobriety. The first person to benefit from the fund was a young miner named Thomas Wright, who had lost his family due to his drinking and was desperately trying to get them back. The fund paid for him to attend a rehabilitation program in Denver and then helped him find steady work at one of the ranches outside town. 6 months later, sober and employed, he was reunited with his wife and children. "This is what I wanted," Zara said when they heard about Thomas's success. "This is how we make sure that what you accomplished isn't just one miracle but the beginning of many." "Our miracle," Ethan corrected gently. "I was the one who needed to get sober, but you were the one who showed me it was possible. This fund should honor both of us." As they moved through their 60s, Ethan and Zara's relationship took on new dimensions. They had weathered every storm marriage could throw at them: financial difficulties, health scares, the normal frustrations of raising children and running a ranch. They had buried Ethan's father and Zara's mother, who had eventually reconciled with her daughter and moved to Fairplay in her final years. They had celebrated marriages and births and anniversaries, and mourned losses, including a grandson who died in infancy. Through all of it, they had remained each other's anchor and safe harbor. When Ethan occasionally struggled with the urge to drink, which still happened even after decades of sobriety, Zara was there to talk him through it. When Zara felt overwhelmed by the demands of family and community, Ethan made sure she had time and space to retreat and recharge. "I can't imagine my life without you," Ethan told her one night as they prepared for bed. It was a conversation they had had before, the natural worry of aging couples about who would go first and how the survivor would cope. "Then don't imagine it," Zara said practically. "We're both here now, and we'll handle whatever comes when it comes. That's what we've always done." In 1920, they celebrated their 42nd wedding anniversary with a large family gathering that filled the ranch house to bursting. All 3 of their children were there with their spouses and children, and the noise and chaos was overwhelming and wonderful. Looking around at all these people who existed because he had made the choice to put down a bottle 44 years ago, Ethan felt a gratitude so intense it brought tears to his eyes. "What are you thinking?" Martha asked, noticing her father's emotional state. "That I almost missed all of this," Ethan said honestly. "If your mother hadn't walked into my life when she did, none of you would exist. This family, this legacy, all of it hangs on that one moment when I decided to try being sober. Then we're all grateful Mama arrived exactly when she did, Samuel said, raising his glass in a toast. To the woman who saved our father and gave us our lives. To Mama, the whole family echoed, and Zara blushed but smiled, pleased and embarrassed by the attention. That night, alone again in their bedroom, Ethan held Zara close and thought about the passage of time, about how they had grown from young lovers to middle-aged partners to elderly companions. Her body was softer now, marked by age and the bearing of children, but she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Her mind was as sharp as ever, her sense of humor intact, her love for him unwavering. 42 years, he murmured into her hair. And I love you more now than I did on our wedding day. That's because you know me better now, Zara said with a smile in her voice. You've seen me at my worst and somehow still want to wake up next to me. Always, Ethan said simply. For whatever time we have left, it's always going to be you. They made love slowly and gently, the passion of youth transformed into something deeper and more tender, and afterward they lay tangled together, comfortable in the silence that comes from decades of knowing each other's thoughts. The 1920s brought changes to Fairplay and to the Ellis family. The town got electricity in 1922, and suddenly the world seemed both smaller and brighter. Radio broadcasts brought news from around the country and the world. Automobiles became common, replacing horses for many purposes, though the ranch still relied heavily on its herds. Ethan and Zara adapted to the changes with the flexibility of people who had already weathered multiple transformations. They got electricity installed in the ranch house, marveling at the convenience of electric lights after decades of oil lamps. They even bought an automobile, though Ethan insisted on keeping his horses for personal use, unwilling to give up that connection to his past. In 1926, on the 50th anniversary of Zara's arrival in Fairplay, the town threw a celebration in their honor. Ethan was 74 years old, his body showing the wear of decades of ranch work, but his mind still sharp. Zara was 72, moving more slowly than she once had, but still vibrant and engaged with the world around her. 50 years, Ethan said to the assembled crowd at the celebration. Half a century since a woman stepped off a stagecoach and changed my life forever. I was a drunk cowboy with no future that day, and she saw something in me worth saving. Or maybe she just gave me a reason to save myself. Either way, everything good in my life flows from that moment. Thank you, Zara, for taking a chance on a broken man and helping him become whole again. There wasn't a dry eye in the house when he finished speaking, and Zara, who rarely showed public emotion, had tears streaming down her face as she embraced him. They danced together one more time, moving slowly and carefully through the steps they had danced at their wedding and countless times since, and the crowd gave them a standing ovation. That night, back at the ranch, they sat together on their porch under the stars. It was late July, almost exactly 50 years since the day they had met, and the air was warm and sweet with the scent of late-blooming wildflowers. Do you remember what you said to me that first day? Zara asked. When you offered me your mother's rooms. I said a lot of things that first day, Ethan admitted. Most of them probably stupid. You said this town wasn't kind to women traveling alone, and you wanted to make sure I was safe. Even when you were at your lowest point, you were still thinking about protecting someone else. That's when I first thought there might be something special about you. I'm glad you thought so. Otherwise, you would have very sensibly told me to leave you alone and found lodging elsewhere, and we never would have had any of this. Fate, Zara said simply. We were meant to find each other, Ethan. I truly believe that. two broken people who needed each other to become whole. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands as they had done thousands of times over 50 years. The mountains rose around them, unchanged by the passage of human time, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Everything changed and nothing changed, and Ethan felt a profound peace with his life and his choices. Ethan Ellis passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1929, at the age of 77. He died in the bed he had shared with Zara for nearly half a century, holding her hand even in his final moments. The whole town turned out for his funeral, a testament to the impact he had made during his time in Fairplay. He was remembered not as the drunk he had been for 3 years in his 20s, but as the man he had become afterward. A devoted husband and father, a skilled rancher, a pillar of the community, and living proof that redemption was possible for anyone willing to reach for it. Zara lived for another 5 years after Ethan's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She remained in the ranch house they had built together, tending the garden that had become her life's work, and visiting the grave on the hillside where both Ethan and his father Jacob rested. She spoke often of her late husband, keeping his memory alive for the youngest generation who had never known him. On a warm afternoon in May of 1934, Zara Bennett Ellis died quietly while sitting in her beloved garden, surrounded by the flowers and vegetables that had been her joy for nearly 60 years. She was 82 years old, and she died with a smile on her face, as though she could see something beautiful that no one else could see. They buried her beside Ethan on the hillside, with a view of the mountains she had fallen in love with the day she arrived in Fairplay. The headstone was simple: Zara Bennett Ellis, 1852-1934. Beloved wife, mother, teacher, friend, she showed him the light, and together they found their way home. The Ellis family legacy continued through subsequent generations. The ranch remained in family hands, passed down through Samuel's line, and expanded to include modern ranching techniques while honoring the traditions Ethan and Jacob had established. The garden Zara had created was maintained as a memorial, each new generation learning to plant and tend it as she had taught. The Ellis Family Recovery Fund continued its work, helping hundreds of people over the decades find their way out of addiction and into productive lives. It stood as a lasting testament to what Ethan had overcome and what he and Zara had built together, a reminder that second chances were possible and that one person's redemption could ripple outward to touch countless lives. In the end, the story of Ethan Ellis and Zara Bennett was a story about the transformative power of love and choice. It was about a man who had been drowning but chose to reach for the surface when given a reason to hope. It was about a woman who took a chance on a stranger and found a partner worth building a life with. It was about the quiet courage of staying sober one day at a time, of choosing life over oblivion, of believing that tomorrow could be better than today. Most of all, it was a story about second chances, about how a single moment can change everything if you're brave enough to let it. Ethan hadn't been sober in 3 years the day Zara arrived, but he put down the bottle and never picked it up again, and that choice made all the difference. Together they built a life, a family, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Proof that redemption is real and love can heal even the deepest wounds. And somewhere in the mountains above Fairplay, where the aspens turn gold each fall and the snow falls deep each winter, their spirits rest together, still holding hands after all these years, still grateful for the day a woman stepped off a stagecoach and a broken man decided he wanted to be whole again.